Hi everybody, I'm Felix Wemheuer and I like to share my thoughts with you on the burden of the Iron Rice Bowl, China's economic adjustment and austerity under stage socialism 61 to 63. And here you can see a cartoon and the iron fist of a contract system is destroying the Iron Rice Bowl. The questions of my research are why did reformers in the early 1960s identify socialist entitlements to welfare and lifelong employment as a burden for state and economy? In China, this was called the Iron Rice Bowl. Why and how did the Chinese leadership enforce radical austerity programs during the so-called readjustment of national economy? And why did the austerity program result into a backlash during the Cultural Revolution? I want to link my ideas on China to a more global background, and I'm just edited reader controversies on Marxist socialism. And it includes the debates also in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, and in China. So in the early 1960s, it was quite obvious that many programs to overtake capitalism in production failed, and it was kind of very unrealistic that socialism would become more productive than capitalism in a short period of time. In China, this overambitious program of the Great Leap Forward to overtake Great Britain even resulted in famine. So against this background, in a socialist camp, they started a second reform wave of economic reforms. Maybe we can date it at 62. It's the Soviet Union. It started with the Lieberman debate, and it ended in most of the countries after the invasion of the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia. And China had already ended with the Cultural Revolution in 66. In some countries like Hungary and Yugoslavia, the economic reforms last a little longer. An important global background in this context is also the Sino-Soviet split. But I first want to make some more general comments. Maybe you already listened to the talk of Professor Andrew Sloan, and he argued in the Soviet Union, workers received wages, wage labor, and they bought commodities from their wages, and therefore the Soviet Union had a capitalist mode of production. Indeed, workers received wages and bought commodities, but I would argue that at least inside the permanent workforce in the state-owned industry, labor was largely decommodified. People that owned their jobs for a lifetime. It was very hard to fire them. And for example, in China, in the work units, they did not even have labor contracts, but membership books. And in Germany, my labor is also fully decommodified because I'm a public servant for a lifetime. I also receive a wage every month, but I don't have any labor contract, but only one piece of paper where it's written that the state have to take care of me until I die. And back to the state socialist model. Education, housing, and healthcare cultural activities, at least for the urban population, were also partly decommodified. Many of the services were for free or provided by the state for symbolic prices. In the GDR, this was called the second pay package. So many needs were already taken care of and covered by the state and not provided in a form of commodity as, for example, today in the US you have to pay a lot of money for education, housing, and healthcare. And in this state socialist system, food prices were highly subsidized. By the early 1960s, some reform politicians and also economists start to critique this system and for the following reasons. So it caused a huge burden for the state budget, or also this subsidies for food and welfare packages, and they estimate that by the 1970s these subsidies were a heavier burden for the Soviet state budget than the defense. Defense. And in many state socialist countries, they wanted to make compromises with the peasantry, and the government decided to raise the prices for the purchase of agricultural goods from the peasantry, but they hesitated to raise the prices for sale, and therefore these gaps that had to be subsidized between the purchase and sales prices even became much larger. The economists argued that there would be a kind of weak link between bonuses and performances. There were actually bonuses, but there were also phenomena like plan bargaining, soft budgeting, and so on. So the system of bonuses had a quite of a limited impact. It was more used for reward than for punishment. And then these reform economists, they argued that there is only kind of one-sided labor market where the workers, they can quit and go to other enterprises to get a better package, but it was very difficult for the enterprises to fire people from the permanent workforce. And they argued this would result in hoarding and hiding of resources and labor power by enterprises to react to shortages. So they would not honestly report about to the government about their resources. Actually, Lieberman also used this phenomena to argue for reforms, and there would be an unreasonable and unflexible distribution of labor. For example, there was a lot of manpower hoarded in old industries, and that it was very difficult or costly to get labor power to new developing industries. Many socialist states, they praise themselves for abolishing unemployment, but the reformers, they would argue there actually only a hidden unemployment inside the enterprises. Today, David Graeber calls this bullshit jobs. Jobs that are totally unnecessary. Yeah, it was a good topic for a dissertation, bullshit jobs under state socialism. And at least in China, there was a critique of social injustices because a small percentage, maybe 15% of the population, had all these welfare entitlements of the Iron Rice Bowl, but the peasants were only second-class citizens. And by that time, there was, of course, already this more right-wing criticism from dissidents or from Western economists that there was not only the right to labor, but also the duty to labor, and this would be a kind of a forced and unfree form of labor. So they were just well paid or well treated serfs or servants. So the reformers and economists, they made often similar proposals. For example, Lieberman, Otto Sick or Sung Yafang in China, they demanded more autonomy for the enterprises. There should be a stronger link between performance and bonuses, and this evaluation should be based on profit and loss of the enterprises. They argued for more hierarchical wage structures based on qualification and performance, and to argue for commodification of labor or to allow massive unemployment, of course, was taboo. But when you read the works of Lieberman and Sick, they argued for closing of enterprises and layoffs should be possible on a limited level. Here in this picture you can see a Chinese translation of Lieberman's works. Actually, it's just for internal distribution. Yeah, now I will move to the Chinese case. So after the foundation of the PRC in 1949, China first copied, I think, a kind of traditional Stalinist model of development with a focus on heavy industry. And in one of my books, I have this graph. So the main idea was how to pump resources from the countryside into the industry, and the state created a monopoly for the purchase of sale of grain and would purchase the surplus from the peasants, or even more sometimes, and then sell it to the urban population who were entitled to buy food with rations in state-owned shops. And this is maybe different from Eastern Europe. So in China, food for the urban population was rationized from the mid-1950s to the early 80s, and the state would use some of the agricultural surplus to export it to the Soviet Union or other socialist states to import industrial technology. So in 1958, the government started the over-ambitious program of the Great Leap Forward, and that resulted in a great imbalance between agriculture, production, urban consumption, and agriculture and industry as such. The system that was set up was highly hierarchical. So the highest rations would get workers in the heavy industry and soldiers, and also the food that was considered best, like white rice and wheat, while the peasants were outside the system, had no entitlement to rations, and would rely on the production output of the agricultural collectives, and often they had to rely on sweet potato and maize and unpopular kinds of food in order to survive. And they were the most vulnerable group in the system when the production decreased rapidly during the Great Leap Forward. So people were mainly starving in the countryside, not So the over-ambitious industrial programs of the Great Leap Forward created a huge pressure for the urban supply system, and in return the state had to use even more force to confiscate and get this grain out of the countryside. So here, just to show you one number, so the urban population between 57 and 60 decreased by almost 20 million people. In my book Famine Politics you can read about it in more detail. Yeah, and the government came to the conclusion that a whole rebalancing of the national economy was needed to rebalance agriculture and industry, but also agricultural production and urban consumption. So the following policies were enforced. So the government decided that the urban population should be reduced by 28 million people. That were even more than the people who had entered the cities during the Great Leap Forward. Not included in this program were people who were inside the permanent workforce of the urban enterprises before the Great Leap Forward started. The government decided to downsize and to stop and to cancel many industrial programs that had also an impact on the women. So during the Great Leap Forward, many women were mobilized to work in this new small urban industries, and many of them were just sent home. The government enforced a very strict control on rural-urban migration with a goal to stop urbanization, because they believed that it was impossible to feed a urban population that was more than 20% of the total population. And the state decided also to import about 5 million tons of grain yearly to feed important cities. That resulted in lower burden for the peasants, and the state also decided to increase the prices for the purchase of agricultural goods by 25% to create incentives for the peasantry to produce more. However, they did not dare to raise the prices for sale. And last but not least, the most radical projects of communist transformation in the countryside were stopped. The people's communes became smaller, and also plots for private use inside the people's commune were reduced, so that the people who were sent back to the countryside could feed themselves, but also to create some incentive that people were willing to go back. So here I want to just give you some numbers. That is a reduction of employees in the state and collectively owned enterprises. It's about 59 million in 1960s, and then it's reduced to 43 million in 66. 1963. You also can stop the video to look at these numbers in more detail. Yeah, and it was also that a dual labor market now was introduced by the government. So Liu Shaoqi gave several speeches to justify these policies. So he often was then connected to this policies, but I think during that time Mao also supported him. So there was still long-term employment, like the Iron Rice Bowl in the state-owned enterprises, but also they allowed a temporary contract work called 合同工 or 临时工 that would allow that companies could make contracts for temporary tasks without any entitlements to welfare and healthcare benefits and so on. And the government also legalized a system of peasant workers where then state work units could make contracts with People's Commune, and the People's Commune would send a certain amount of labor then to the cities, and they then would just return to the People's Commune when the contracts were expired. And in education, the government also started to establish a dual-track education system where you have a regular track with primary school, middle school, high school, university. But in rural China, they promoted schools under the slogan half studying and half producing that were designed to train rural labor, and it was very difficult when you were in this schools to get back on a regular track. So later this was criticized as discriminating against peasants. When the Cultural Revolution started, this austerity policies faced a backlash. By late 1966, Mao allowed also workers to form rebel organization, and so also temporary workers were forming their organization, especially in Shanghai. And here you can see Liu Shaoqi again in a propaganda poster where he smashed as a traitor of the workers that should be excluded from the Communist Party. In many pamphlets, then these organizations criticized temporary labor as capitalist exploitation and an expression of the revisionist line of Liu Shaoqi. Their demands were job security, right to stay in the cities, and also access to welfare and other benefits. The government reacted very soon. So in the beginning, several rebel organizations and ministries had proclaimed a common announcement that contract labor would be abolished soon. But in February of 1967, the State Council and also the Central Committee declared that this announcement was illegal and contract labor would still be needed. The government then prohibited temporary workers forming their own rebel organization, and a campaign was launched against so-called economism that attacked material demands in the movement of the Cultural Revolution, and argued that the Cultural Revolution is a political movement against revisionism and should not focus just on better wages and welfare standards. However, I think there was some pressure created to act. So by 1971, the State Council decided that work units were not allowed to use temporary labor for year-round production tasks, and as a result, over 8 million temporary workers could change their status to permanent. Also, some of these temporary workers were wives of permanent workers. So when the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, the workforce in the state-owned enterprises had massively increased. Now I come to the conclusion. So the evaluation of this economic readjustment. So the government reduced the number of people inside the system, called in China, radically, but was unwilling to destroy the system of the Iron Rice Bowl as such. Forced population transfers to the countryside were used to solve the problem of rural unemployment, and also again during the Cultural Revolution there was a send-down program of the youth, also partly related to this problem. And I like to ask the colleagues from Eastern Europe or people who work on the Soviet Union whether or not in the 1960s in any other state socialist country it would have been possible just to transfer millions of people to the countryside. I guess not. I think in China it was possible, also partly because the peasantry was outside this system of the socialist welfare state, and the countryside was in general used as a dumping ground for population that was not wanted in the cities. However, these policies of readjustment challenged socialist understandings of justice and fair labor condition. As a result, it met criticism and resistance during the Cultural Revolution. After Mao died and the leadership under Deng Xiaoping launched the reform and opening, the government then used a kind of very different approach to this problem. So the slogan was then in the 1980s to smash the iron rice bowl by introducing labor contracts in the work unions. Also by the late 1980s, also like part-time and short-time contracts were made possible. Here you can see official publication in English with this slogan, smashing the pot, right? Here's a responsibility system is the key word. The send-down youth of the Cultural Revolution were allowed to return to the cities, and the state liberated the rural surplus population by allowing rural-urban migration and also by decollectivization. And this cheap labor then filled the factories that China would become the benchmark of the world then later in the 1990s. By the mid-1980s, the state had abolished rationing and the monopoly for the sale and purchase of grain. And it took a while until parts of the state-owned industry were privatized. Maybe we can call it a shock therapy. The restructuring of the state-owned industry under Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin between 1998 and 2002, where parts of the state-owned industry were shut down, parts were privatized, and other parts were transformed into stock companies. There are estimates that over 40 million people were laid off, and I think only by then labor was fully commodified in China, and by the 1990s I think China can be labeled as a capitalist mode of production. So for the future research, it would be very interesting to look more at transnational entanglements in the socialist world during the second cycle of reforms in the 1960s. There's some work on the 1980s, such as by Isabella Weber, but I think this is really a new field to look at the early 1960s. And I think it's very important to link these debates of the reformers and the economists more to social history and also struggles. Because in my presentation I think I have shown that also struggles of workers played a role, and there also was a massive resistance to this austerity politics to smash the iron rice bowl, or at least to limit the number of people who could enjoy the iron rice bowl. So thank you very much.